The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Adam Eichen on the fight to end winner-take-all elections. Ganesh Sitaraman on reviving the reforms of the progressive era. Plus, Bill Press with Jerry Brown and Pete Buttigieg on why U.S. foreign policy needs a major fix. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Adam Eichen is an author and activist focused on highlighting the emerging democracy movement in the United States. He says that the path to citizen equality demands fundamental reforms to the way we vote. And we say hello to Adam Eichen, campaigns manager at Equal Citizens and co-author with Francis Moore Lapay of Daring Democracy, Igniting Power, Meaning, and Connection for the America We Want. Adam Eichen, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Your organization, Equal Citizens, shares a mission with many other organizations to fix democracy. How do you see your unique role in that universe?
Well, at Equal Citizens, we work to help out all the other different organizations in the reform movement, but also look to litigate creative legal cases around the Electoral College, super PACs, as well as try to push innovative reforms like ranked choice voting in the presidential election. And I hope we can speak about that a little bit. But really, we see our role as a scrappy little organization that's looking to push our country a little bit closer to citizen equality.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the main platforms of Equal Citizens is equal representation. And under that heading, you've set a goal, which is to reform the Electoral College. One of the original goals of the Electoral College was to make sure smaller and more rural states had a voice. Why is that not working in today's politics?
Well, today the Electoral College doesn't benefit swing or rural states or small states at all. I mean, because of the way states allocate their electoral votes in a winner-take-all fashion, that means if you win one more vote than your opponent, you get 100% of the electoral votes. Really, the only states that matter are the swing states. And if you look at the swing states, they're not really small nor rural. They're a lot of them are big, and they don't really represent the rest of the country. They're a lot whiter than other states in the country, and they only represent a fraction of the overall population. So the way the Electoral College works in practice is really not about protecting small states or rural states. It's really just to the benefit of a handful of randomly selected states that just happen to be relatively even in terms of partisan split. And that's not beneficial to anybody in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, well, and it's important to point out when the Electoral College was conceived and where our world is today too. I mean, it's we update a lot of things. We haven't updated that. There are also concerns about the Electoral College having an impact on voters of color. Do you share that concern?
Yeah, I do share that concern. As I said, because of winner take all, the Electoral College produces swing states, and those swing states are not representative of the country as a whole. They're whiter than the rest of the country, and moreover, because the Electoral College, the number of electors is in part determined by the Senate. You have rural states that are primarily white getting boosted representation that does decrease the voting power of very diverse states such as California or New York or Texas.
Something else to talk about that I think is a bit concerning, and this is from a recent study by economics researchers at the University of Texas, and their work suggests that the Electoral College will continue to advantage Republican candidates who lose the popular vote. How worried should we be about that?
Well, I think we should be very worried about undemocratic outcomes determined by the Electoral College because, a minority president has happened 5 times in American history, and it's happened twice since 2000. We had Al Gore winning the popular vote, losing the Electoral College, and we had Donald Trump losing the popular vote and winning the Electoral College. And as you say, the research shows this, but equally concerning for me is, as more and more blue states pass pro-voter reforms like automatic voter registration or same-day registration, and as more and more red states try and suppress the vote, I think you will see a more likelihood of a split between the Electoral College vote and the popular vote. Because ultimately, as I said, it's just getting enough swing states to get on your side. And if you win those barely, you get 100% of the electoral votes. And you could run up the score 8 million votes in California, but that doesn't mean anything because California is only worth a certain number of electoral votes, and having a surplus in that state doesn't really do you any good. It's really about how distributed your votes are as opposed to how many votes total you get. And that is just not a democratic system at all.
Yeah, agreed. We're speaking with Adam Eichen, campaigns manager at Equal Citizens, also co-author with Francis Moore Lepay of Daring Democracy, Igniting Power, Meaning, and Connection for the America We Want. Adam, in the New Republic, you wrote a piece that explains how the popular vote can have a real impact on policy. How does that work, for example, say with regard to coal and ethanol?
Well, what the social science shows is because there's such a focus on swing states, it actually skews the priorities of candidates and the elected presidents, upon assuming office. And that namely is targeted to swing states. So, for example, coal. Pennsylvania has a lot of coal mines. So presidents will talk a lot about coal miners. Or ethanol. Because of Iowa, the ethanol market there is huge, and they'll direct subsidies to that market. You'll see it regarding tariffs. You'll see it regarding a lot of different types of policies. Ever so slightly, they become skewed to benefit to pork barrel for those states. And actually, you do find that swing states get more federal grants than non-swing states. So it hurts everybody. I mean, I guess it benefits if you just happen to live in one of those 14 states. But if you're not, you're also getting economically hurt by this as well as politically hurt.
All right. So, Adam, ranked choice voting, you mentioned that earlier. Another strategy that you endorse. How does ranked choice voting challenge the impact of the Electoral College?
Well, so look, for your listeners who don't know, ranked choice voting is a system where voters can rank candidates in order of preference. And if no candidate wins a majority of the vote, the last place vote getter has their votes eliminated and reallocated according to second choices. And this will produce a majority winner. I think of the election in Florida. If people have been able to rank their choices, people who voted for Ralph Nader would have likely wanted Al Gore as their second choice. And had they been able to do so, if Ralph Nader did not win and there was no majority, which there wasn't, the Nader votes would have been reallocated according to second preference. And then those votes would have gone to Gore, and Gore would have had the majority of votes after those votes were reallocated. So this wouldn't change the Electoral College per se, but what it would do is it would ensure that the winner of swing states, those who get all of the electoral votes in a given swing state because of winner take all, at least have a majority of the vote. And that is, for me, critical. That if we are going to keep this system, although I think that we should change the system, but in the immediate term, in the run-up to 2020, if enough states do this, it will at least produce, or more likely to produce, a majority winner. And that, to me, is key.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Now, Equal Citizens has been tracking presidential candidates' democracy reform platforms and encouraging them to endorse key reforms. How's that been going?
It's been going very, very well. The debates, the moderators at the debates have not been asking questions about democracy. There hasn't been a single question about democracy reform on any of the debates, and that's a huge disappointment. But candidates themselves are talking about democracy reform, and that's a big, big step towards reform. And in fact, we've gotten 10 candidates to commit to a strong democracy reform platform and to agree that fixing democracy will be the very first thing they do if elected office. That's remarkable progress, to me and to my colleagues and really to the reform movement as a whole, because what that means is we have a real chance in this next election to elect what we call a POTUS 1 candidate, a candidate that understands that democracy reform is a priority and critical to all the other different types of policies that we want to enact to make this country a better place.
It would be nice to hear more people talking about it because, as you pointed out earlier in our discussion, this has happened too many times already, the few times that it has happened, but that's too many times as it is.
Yes, absolutely. And, that gives me hope. And people who want to, any of your listeners who want to know more about this, they can go to our, what we call POTUS One page at equalcitizens.us. We rank all the candidates. We rank their policy platforms. And frankly, I look at that page and I'm very encouraged. To me, that says that this reform movement is growing and that, change is going to be potentially possible in 2021.
Okay. Adam Eichen, campaigns manager at Equal Citizens. And again, you can check it out, equalcitizens.us. He's also co-author with Francis Moore LePay of Daring Democracy, Igniting Power, Meaning, and Connection for the America We Want. Joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Adam, thank you for your time with us. We very much appreciate it and look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Great, thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, reviving the progressive era to rescue democracy today. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote of being leery of a fast-talking huckster who visited his home. The louder he talked of his honor, the faster we counted our spoons, Emerson exclaimed. Likewise, today's workaday families should do a mass inventory of their silverware, for the fast-talking CEOs of 181 union-busting, tax-cheating, environment-contaminating, consumer-gouging corporations are asking us to believe that they stand with us in the fight against them. From Wall Street banksters to big oil polluters, these profiteers are suddenly trumpeting their future intentions to serve not just their own greed, but every, quote, stakeholder, which is what they call employees, customers, suppliers, etc. But vague proclamations are cheap, and it's worth noting that these new champions of the common good propose no specifics, no actual sacrifices by them or benefits for us. A few media observers have mildly objected, saying it's, quote, an open question whether any of the corporate proclaimers will change how they do business. But it's not an open question at all. They won't. They won't support full collective bargaining power for workers, won't join the public's push to get Medicare for all, won't stop using monopoly power to squeeze out small competitors and gouge consumers, won't support measures to stop climate change, won't back reforms to get their corrupt corporate money out of our politics, won't embrace any of the big structural changes necessary to reverse the raw economic and political inequality that has enthroned their plutocratic rule. This is Jim Hightower saying, in fact, their empty proclamation is what West Texas cowboys might call bovine excrement, meant to fend off the actual changes that real reformers are advancing. Corporate elites aren't about to fix inequality for us. They're the ones doing it to us.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Legal scholar Ganesh Sitaraman writes about the core connection between democracy and economic equality. He says that as concentrated wealth and power distort our democracy, it's time to recall the progressives who fought back over 100 years ago. And we say hello to Ganesh Sitaraman, Chancellor Faculty Fellow, Professor of Law, and Director of the Program in Law and Government at Vanderbilt Law School. He's also the author of numerous books, including most recently with Ann L. Alstott, The Public Option: How to Expand Freedom, Increase Opportunity, and Promote Equality. Ganesh Sitaraman, thank you very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You recently wrote a piece that appeared in The Guardian titled, "To Rescue Democracy, We Must Revive the Reforms of the Progressive Era." And you issue this warning: the danger of a permanent inequality of conditions and aristocracy is upon us. What is it about this moment which is so alarming to you?
So I think the challenge of this moment is that we are in a time of century-high levels of inequality. A lot of people consider this era the second Gilded Age, referring back to the first Gilded Age that happened more than 100 years ago. And that was a period of extreme economic inequality, both for individuals, where there was a divide between the very, very wealthy and everyone else, but also in terms of corporate power, where there was increasing consolidation and concentration of power in markets in the hands of a very small number of corporations. And that's something that we're seeing today as well. We're seeing a concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a very small number of people and companies. And that's a problem both for our economy, but it's also a problem for our democracy. It's a problem for our democracy because power, even economic power, can turn into political power. And that reshapes a representative democracy into being increasingly unrepresentative.
Well, and as you write in the article, there is reason for optimism because there's a playbook that comes from the thinkers and activists of the progressive era. This took place, as you mentioned, 100 years ago. How similar were the conditions then to what we face now?
So I do think that we should be optimistic, even though we are in this time period of deep inequality. And the reason why is exactly as you just mentioned. It's not that situations of inequality are totally unprecedented. We have had similar situations in our history, including in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. And there were people at that time who worked to come up with answers for how we might address those problems. And so I think some of the conditions then that we see that are similar to today, as I've mentioned, are the deep levels of inequality in income and wealth between individuals. The extreme concentration of economic power in markets into a smaller and smaller number of companies that dominate every sector almost. And on top of that, the influence of economic power on politics and on our democracy. These were all similar kinds of problems that people were engaging with a century ago during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. And, I think the fact that we moved beyond that time period back then should give us hope and give us a sense of optimism that we can move beyond our current Gilded Age as well.
And I want to stay within that progressive era. What are some of the ideas that defined the progressive era and its agenda?
So I think there's really three big categories that we can think about for how progressives, in terms of their ideas and in terms of their policies, thought about how we could address the problem of economic power. The first is they thought that we could restrain economic power, and they came up with a variety of ways to do this. So one was antitrust laws. The progressives and the people of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era passed America's first antitrust laws in order to break up concentrations of economic power in the corporate sector. They also adopted public utilities regulations, saying that in some areas we just want direct government provision of certain things, and those should be regulated like utilities. In addition, they passed income taxes in order to tax the wealthiest people, and this actually required a constitutional amendment, so a pretty significant change. All of those are areas where you're restricting economic power and trying to prevent it from getting too big, too powerful. At the same time, though, they were pushing for ways to lift up ordinary people economically. And so during this time period, you had moves for the 40-hour work week and minimum wage laws and labor laws and equal pay for equal work for women. It was a time when there was a lot of debate about how and what we could do to try to improve the lives of workers and people who did not have as much. So that's a second category on the economic side. And then I think the third bucket that's really important here is that people understood that economic power was a threat to democracy, and so they tried to find ways to prevent it from influencing democracy too much. So, for example, this is the era where we see the first real federal campaign finance laws. And it's also a time period where we pass a constitutional amendment to shift toward the election of senators by the people, rather than the structure that had been set up originally in the Constitution, which was the selection of senators by members of the state legislature. And this was a really big change also, and one that had as part of its impetus the understanding that there was a lot of corruption going on in the background.
Let's look at policy. What are some of the most important economic reforms of that time?
Yeah, so I think some of these examples, especially antitrust, is one of the biggest policy reforms of the era that, is really an important one. What you see at that time period is a massive merger movement that happens that results in the consolidation of firms all across different parts of the economy right around the turn of the 20th century. And the antitrust laws, passed first in 1890 and then another in 1914, really put into place a set of principles that in some ways is a kind of economic constitution, and understanding that we should disperse power in our economy in the same way that we disperse power in our politics. We have a system of checks and balances, so no one can become too powerful and no one can be a tyrant in our government. And the people at the time also understood we shouldn't want anyone to be so powerful and become a tyrant in our economy. And so I think that's one of the areas where there was a lot of motion and interest then. And I think an important thing for us to think about today as well.
We're speaking with Ganesh Sitaraman, Chancellor, Faculty Fellow, Professor of Law, and Director of the Program in Law and Government at Vanderbilt Law School, author of numerous books, including most recently, along with Ann Alstott, The Public Option: How to Expand Freedom, Increase Opportunity, and Promote Equality. And Ganesh, in terms of democracy, reformers during the Progressive Era passed some of the first federal campaign finance laws, as well as a constitutional amendment for the direct election of senators. How big were these changes for politics as usual at that time?
Well, these were big changes, and especially the direct election of senators. And that's a big change for a couple of reasons. First, it's a constitutional amendment. So, I think anytime we are changing the fundamental charter of government for the country, it's a big change. And that was a big one, getting to really the heart of the structure of the Senate. And it's a really interesting one. Prior to this amendment, senators were selected by members of state legislatures. And one of the challenges that happened is that many people who were, rich and powerful would try to buy off state legislatures. And, there are some horrifying examples. One case in particular in Montana where there's just bribery going on in order to get members of the state legislature to choose a particular person to be a senator. And that's the kind of thing that was going on in this period. And so the shift to direct election was in part meant as a way to prevent the corruption that was going on in the selection of these representatives and actually make them more representative of the people. So that was a big change, and I think a really important one for how we think about the structure of our government. And it was directly tied in part to how people understood corruption and how economic power was infecting our democracy.
And now let's put it to today. In pulling from the example of the progressive era, what are some of the reforms they brought about that should be at the center of progressive politics today?
Well, I think all of the reforms from that era need to be thought about and adapted to our time. And in some ways, what we're already seeing is that there is an energy to reviving policy in some of these areas. A good example of that is antitrust law. This is an area that has really been ignored to a large extent in public policy for many decades now. And in recent years, there's been a real revival of people who were interested in taking antitrust more seriously and trying to combat monopoly power in the economy. And that's something that's been emerging. There's, a slew of new books out right now, even on this topic, from Matt Stoller's book Goliath to Tim Wu's book The Curse of Bigness. There's a lot of energy around this, particularly when it comes to technology companies and thinking about what's happening to our economy. How is it getting how is it so few companies can be so powerful in every sector? It's not just things like tech and telecom, but pharma and agriculture and lots of different areas. Another area that seems really promising, I think, is thinking about tax policy. This was an era in the progressive era where they passed a constitutional amendment to put in place income taxes. And something that people are thinking about today is, do we really have a tax system that is one that is fair and creates both a level playing field, but also ensures that the people who are the most successful in our country contribute so that everyone has a chance to be successful in our country? And so I think that's another place where people are really thinking about it. The third area that I'd raise is the structural reforms to our system of government. We've had in the progressive era, the biggest changes, the introduction of campaign finance laws, the direct election of senators, as we've already talked about. And I think today we're seeing people interested again in campaign finance reforms, in structural reforms to the Senate, in thinking about these basic reforms that hopefully can break the power of the super powerful and wealthy, and actually make our government more responsive to ordinary citizens.
Something else that you write about, it's that every generation has to adapt the progressive playbook to its own unique challenges. What challenges face progressives today that are different than 100 years ago?
So I think every generation has slightly different challenges. And that doesn't mean that the playbook has to be totally written from scratch. It just means that it has to be thought about and adapted to those challenges. So, for example, in the progressive era, one of the big monopolies they worried about were railroads. We don't worry as much about railroads these days. We think about technology companies, for example. But that doesn't mean that we should be afraid of technology or technology companies, that we should see them as wholly unprecedented in the history of the world. It means that we just need to think deeply about business models, about practices, and about what kinds of tools are out there and have been out there in law and policy for addressing the problems that emerge. And that's something that we can do. It just takes us, adapting to the different contexts that we're in now, where there are different kinds of companies and problems in our economy. But I think what's at the core of this is that a lot of the models that the progressives used are actually still quite applicable today. We just have to figure out how exactly they apply.
Mm-hmm. Now, Ganesh, you really make an important point in suggesting that as we remember what these progressive reformers did, it's just as important to recognize that they had the political courage to do it. Do you see that same kind of courage today?
Well, I'm hopeful that we have that courage today. And I think one of the things that gives me hope about that is we have a lot of people, whether it's grassroots organizations, people in Congress, people out in states and in local governments, who are trying to make bold change and trying to address some of these core problems. But I think it's really going to take that kind of courage, because the challenge that we have and the challenge that they had is a challenge about power. And when there's a lot of concentration of power in the hands of a very small number of people, they don't want to give it up. And so part of the challenge is having the courage to say we need to change the rules. We need to have a structure in our system that is more equitable, that's more fair, that's more just. But it's going to be hard to accomplish that. But I'm optimistic. I think it's something we can do, in part because, I feel like I see and meet a lot of people who are excited about taking on those fights and doing that work. So I think there's a real chance right now for us to build a more progressive and more just future. And it's one, though, that's going to require all of us to have some courage, not just one or two people, not just a few leaders, but a real movement of people who are ready to push for that kind of change that we need.
Yeah, and it's not just about getting out and voting, which is extremely important, of course, but it's getting involved. It's being a part of it all, and you got to make the change happen yourself if you want it to really change. Exactly. That's exactly right. Part of it is being involved not just once every 2 years or 4 years at the ballot box, but being involved every day in as many ways as you can. Absolutely. Ganesh Sitaraman, Chancellor, Faculty Fellow, Professor of Law, Director of the Program in Law and Government at Vanderbilt Law School, and author. His most recent book, along with Ann L. Alstott, The Public Option, How to Expand Freedom, Increase Opportunity, and Promote Equality. Ganesh, thank you so much for your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We look forward to having you back again with us soon. Thank you. You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The role of America in the world today. Bill Press talks with presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg and former California Governor Jerry Brown.
I'd like to get your sense of where we are in Syria. I mean, millions of migrants have destabilized the politics in Europe, particularly in Germany and Italy. So many people have been killed, women, children, the gas attacks, all the rest of it. So what are your thoughts on Syria? What is America's role? What should it have been? And where the heck do we go from here?
Well, I think America's priority has to be ensuring American safety. And we have to accept the fact that there are problems that we can solve, and then there are problems that you'll just have to manage. And unfortunately, I think for the near term, a lot of the problems in the Middle East and in that region are in that second category, problems that we got to manage in a way that is responsible and that keeps America safe. But that does not mean we shoulder the burden of what the outcomes are going to be. I actually think that was the direction we were working in prior to the president's recent decision. In other words, we had a very, very small number of highly specialized people on the ground who were really all that stood between that region and the beginnings of a potential genocide, as well as the reemergence of ISIS. Those forces have now been unleashed because of the president's decision to effectively betray Kurdish fighters who had been very good allies to the United States. And I think the ramifications of that decision go far beyond Syria alone. They really go to American credibility on the world stage. The truth is, sometimes part of how we stay out of a conflict, or at least stay out of having large numbers of U.S. troops get entangled or involved somewhere, is because of our alliances, because we're part of a bigger international community that can manage problems or deal with things. If we undercut alliances, or really undercut our ability to even form alliances, which of course is what happens if we send the signal that it's not a safe bet to count on America's word, well, the consequence of that is going to be that the world will become an even more unstable and dangerous place.
Well, now, if we have to manage, which we obviously do, these conflicts in the Middle East, how about Turkey? Turkey is an ally. It's part of NATO. We certainly have some issues with them, but where do we go now?
Well, it's tough when it comes to Syria because it seems the horse is out of the barn, and it's difficult even to gauge what the state of play will be more than a year from now when the new president takes office. But what I will say is that we know that many of the biggest consequences of President Trump abandoning American values has to do with the behavior not of our adversaries, but our allies. We know that our strategic competitors, Russia, China, are going to act in problematic ways if we don't have a smart strategy. But one of the things we've seen is countries we think of as our allies, from Saudi Arabia to Turkey, also behave in ways that are destructive when we give the green light for that sort of thing, as we did with Saudi Arabia's murder of a journalist after the fact, and as we did with Turkey before the fact. Now, we should acknowledge that Turkey does have legitimate security interests on their border, that there is a ton of complexity to what's going on in terms of their concerns about the Kurdish fighters. But that's just the point, is that we had a comparatively stable state of play. And now we've unleashed the kind of chaos that's associated with potential ethnic cleansing and ISIS fighters going free. We need to use, precisely because we are allies or NATO and treaty allies, because of this, we actually have more of an opportunity to influence what's going on for good there than we would with a player like, for example, Iran, which is an adversary that we have less and less leverage over, especially since pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. So all of these add up to why you can't just have an impulsive, reckless decision and expect it to be something you can get away with, or expect its consequences to be confined to one region. And managing the alliance with Turkey is going to require a president who will use the fact that we are allies as a way to ensure that the worst behaviors and impulses of our allies are held in check.
Well, now in Turkey, we know we've got 60 nuclear bombs there that are ready to be delivered, been there for decades as part of our strategy to defend against the Soviet Union. And Turkey's not alone. I think there are nuclear weapons of the United States in Belgium, also the Netherlands. But that raises the point in managing this very complicated relationship with Turkey. What about the nukes? Do you think that extended deterrence reaches the point where maintaining nuclear weapons in a country like Turkey makes sense? Or do we have to find a way to pull back on our forward positioning of nuclear weapons?
Well, I think we need to continuously reevaluate our strategic posture and look at whether it's consistent with our interests, with regional security, and with American values. What we know is that a precipitous decision has terrible knock-on consequences, but we should make sure for the long run that we have a sustainable and affordable policy when it comes to force projection, whether it's with weaponry or with people.
Well, now, you use the word precipitous. I would have to say that the withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty by President Bush, that was precipitous. The withdrawal by Trump from the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, that was precipitous. That both those treaties were negotiated by Republican presidents, one by Nixon, one by Reagan. And now Trump is saying he's going to pull out of the Open Skies Treaty, which allows Americans and other nations and Russia to see what's going on in the air in a way that creates more transparency. And now we got New START, which is the last remaining major treaty between Russia and the United States. There's a lot of talk that Trump wants to pull out of that. So what do you think of all these treaties? They were the essence of our nuclear security, the architecture of engagement with Russia, with the Soviet Union. So where are we now?
Well, I'm from Indiana, which is the home state of Dick Lugar, senator who was, together with Sam Nunn, behind a number of the strategic nuclear weapons reduction treaties that were really key to our engagement with Russia in the years immediately after the post-Cold War, led to the destruction of many nuclear weapons and unquestionably made the world a safer place. We clearly see movements in the wrong direction going on now. Now, some of these things were connected to legitimate concerns. You look at the INF treaty withdrawal. There's no question that there were a lot of issues with Russian compliance, but I think that the impulsiveness of this administration led to this assumption that nothing is better than something, which just isn't true. The solution to the problems with Russian compliance in the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty wasn't to blow it up altogether. The solution would be to try to come out with a stronger agreement than we had. And we need to move, into the direction of greater, not reduced frameworks for the process that's going to lead to strategic reduction, because it's in nobody's interest for us to have this level of buildup continue indefinitely around the world.
Yeah, we got these weapons. I think the estimate is given that the U.S. has approximately 7,000 nuclear warheads. We have almost the same number in reserve, but thousands at the ready to be launched literally within hours if the word comes from the president. On the other hand, the Russians have an equal number ready to go. And we know from the past that there have been mistakes that Russians thought we'd launched several hundred missiles toward them. And there was a mistake during the time when Bill Perry was Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, where they thought that the Russians had launched. And it turned out in both cases a mistake. So there's a lot of talk on Capitol Hill with Trump and the interference with the election and lots of other misdeeds on the part of Mr. Putin. But the reality, the brute reality, is we have thousands of weapons that if by some blunder something gets going, it could escalate, and you could actually eliminate human civilization. So given all this difficulty and tension, and in many ways name-calling with Russia, how do you see moving in the direction where we return to a point of nuclear stability, such that when there was Senator Lugar, he certainly was a Republican championing that, but we're far from that. People are treating the existence of these nuclear weapons as though it's not real, that there isn't this danger of nuclear annihilation. And the most important thing are tweets from the president or calling Putin names or focusing on the latest guy that he's killed or something. But the big question is, how do we return to more nuclear safety and security?
Well, I think there are going to have to be incremental steps that probably start very small, just because the trust now is so low. Now, we've got to retain the ability to respond when Russia undertakes actions like what they did to interfere with our election, using diplomatic and economic and informational and other tools. And we need to begin by ensuring that we're deterring the escalation of conventional conflicts, especially when we're in a region or dealing with a player that also has nuclear capabilities. We've got to make sure that as few conventional conflicts emerge as possible. And then when they do, we've got to make sure that they can be managed with the lowest possible likelihood of escalating into a nuclear confrontation. As long as these levels of armament exist, deterrence and de-escalation are going to be critical. And we need to have relationships and communications channels that continue to minimize risk in a way that, unfortunately, the current chaos of the administration in particular and the environment in general is making harder and harder to do.
Jerry Brown and Pete Buttigieg on the Bill Press Pod. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Adam Eichen, Ganesh Sitaraman, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.